I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, once again, the Iran nuclear deal, known as the JCPA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, meant to prevent Iran from ever developing a nuclear weapon. I'm sure all of you remember how contentious the battle over the Iran deal was in 2015, how many in the Jewish community and many in Congress believe the JCPA might not be the ideal agreement, but that it was the best the world could get from Iran, and that it had an excellent chance of at least delaying Iran's development of a nuclear weapon for perhaps up to 10 years, during which time many things could change on the world scene, including regime change in Iran, which might neutralize any Iranian attempt to develop a nuclear weapon. At the same time, there were many in the Jewish world, following the lead of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who felt the Iran nuclear deal was a disaster, that it prematurely lifted economic sanctions on Iran that had been working, jump-started Iran's economy with billions of dollars, that it did not provide for adequate inspections by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, that it permitted Iran to retain centrifuges and uranium, and that it had too many sunset clauses which ultimately give Iran a nuclear path to nuclear weapons at the conclusion of the 10-year deal. And there were many like Alan Dershowitz in the Jewish community who had been strong supporters of President Obama, but who felt the president had made a terrible mistake in pushing a deal that was so seriously flawed and dangerous to Israel, the entire Middle East, and with intercontinental ballistic missiles, even the United States and the entire world. And now the JCPA has surfaced again as President Trump is calling on Congress to review the terms of the deal. Earlier, the president had threatened to decertify the Iran nuclear deal, but on Friday, October 13th, the president stopped short of decertification, asking Congress to reevaluate the deal and to suggest revisions upgrading the inspection process and linking continued American certification of the deal to Iran's ceasing its destabilizing and terrorist activities in Syria, Iraq, and around the world. Well, just how well has the Iran nuclear deal been working? Has the IAEA been able to conduct adequate inspections? Has Iran complied both with the letter and, as the president points out, the spirit of the JCPA? And what does the president's threat to withholding recertification of the deal really mean in practical terms? For some answers and analysis, I'm so pleased to be joined once again on our JBS phones by a man who has done extensive study and writing around the Iran nuclear deal, Rob Satloff, the Executive Director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he holds the Howard B. Berkowitz Chair in U.S. Middle East Policy. And Rob, it's always a pleasure to speak with you here on JBS.
Hi, Mark. It's a real privilege to talk to you and everybody out there who is a follower of your fantastic show.
Thank you. First of all, Shana Tova, I hope you had a wonderful holiday season and that this is a most healthy, sweet, productive year for you and everyone at the Washington Institute.
Thank you. That's very kind, and the same to you. I appreciate that.
You do fabulous work, as all of you do at the Washington Institute. Rob, before we speak of the president's call on Congress, if you and I had spoken a month ago, how would you have characterized Iranian compliance with the JCPA?
Well, there's a narrow answer and a broader answer to this very legitimate question. The narrow answer is that the International Atomic Energy Agency repeatedly says that it has monitored and verified the terms of the agreement to the extent that it is required and able to do so under the agreement. That is the position of the official monitoring agency. At the same time, the agency also says that there are aspects of the agreement that it is simply unable to monitor or verify. For example, there are pieces of the agreement, commitments that Iran made not to engage in some technical computer modeling to help it that could be useful in building a nuclear weapon. Well, the IAEA has no means to monitor and verify whether the Iranians are doing this or not doing this. And then there's a bigger question, namely the Iranians in the agreement agreed to have certain military sites subject to inspection, but the IAEA has not been asked by some of the signatories of the agreement to undertake these inspections, and so these inspections haven't been done. And then there's an even bigger problem, which is that only agreed military sites are subject to inspection, and the vast majority of the Iranian land mass, the territory of the country, is outside the scope of inspections. So the IAEA inspects what it is told to inspect, it verifies what it is told to verify, but that sentence does not necessarily mean that Iran is not actively engaged in the pursuit of a nuclear weapon. In fact, there's incontrovertible evidence that Iran is engaged in the pursuit of a nuclear weapon. Now, what do I mean? I mean that I'm not just referring to the reports that German intelligence has produced that the Iranians have more than 30 times tried to smuggle in components that would be useful in a nuclear weapons program. Here I'm referring to something else. There are three pieces to a nuclear weapons program. One, enrichment, the gathering of the fissile material that makes the bomb. Two, taking that fissile material and weaponizing it, turning it from just raw nuclear material into a nuclear weapon. And third, delivery, how you get that nuclear weapon from where it is to where you want it to be. The third piece is quite obviously something the Iranians have continued to invest in openly and publicly. It's their ballistic missile program. That's why you have these missiles, is so they can deliver a nuclear weapon. So part of this program has undoubtedly been proceeding apace, while others have been slowed down.
Okay. By the way, the ICBM part of the equation, there are those who said that they were critical of the initial deal because it did not specifically limit ICBM development in Iran. Is that accurate or inaccurate? Inside the nuclear agreement itself, there is no discussion of limitations of ballistic missiles. The nuclear agreement was validated by a UN Security Council resolution that was endorsed by the entire Security Council. In that resolution, there is an additional paragraph which calls on Iran to cease and desist from any ballistic missile development without certain permissions given by the Security Council, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't prohibit it. The language used is it's in UN speak. It's in a language that you and I, regular people, would not appreciate these distinctions. It says, instead of saying Iran is prohibited from doing X, Y, or Z, the language is that the Security Council calls on Iran not to do X, Y, or Z. And in the UN world, that language calls upon
is not definitive. It is not mandatory. It's not as strict and tight as a prohibition. And so Iran is driving a nuclear truck right through this hole in that resolution that, regrettably, the previous administration permitted to get passed with that loose language.
I understand. Look, I referenced already, the president speaks of the spirit of the Iran nuclear deal. You're now referencing really something which, if it is not in the letter of the law, certainly is in the spirit. There are also, Rob, those suggesting that Iran is actually working with North Korea to develop its nuclear program. Do you worry that Iran is working with North Korea? And if so, would that be, in your mind, a violation of the nuclear deal?
Well, any nuclear cooperation that violates the terms of the agreement would be a violation, and then so any working with any surreptitious cooperation with North Korea on nuclear issues would be such a violation. I have grave suspicions here. I mean, the Iranians, the North Koreans, and the Syrians, for that fact, have been thick as thieves on nuclear issues and ballistic missile issues and for years. I mean, one should remember that in a country where the Iranians have a huge role, namely Syria, it was a North Korean nuclear plant that the Israeli Air Force blew up in the latter days of the Bush administration. Now, the idea that the Iranians would not be full partners with the North Koreans in operating inside Syria, of all places, I think is pretty far-fetched. Mm-hmm. No, I think there's a lot of concern, legitimate concern about the connections between Iran and North Korea on these issues, and I think it's one of we're pursuing that sort of research here at the Institute, and I'm sure that U.S. and other intelligence agencies are hot on the trail of this.
Good for you. Rob, you were never a real fan of the Iran nuclear deal. What do you think now about the president suggesting that Congress review it? He threatens to decertify or not recertify the JCPA. That right now is a big story in the news. I want to hear you speak in general about how you feel. How do you feel about this overall point in time with the President of the United States bringing this issue to the fore again?
Right. So, again, I'm sorry to back up, but I think it's important to put some of these things in context. There are some very major advantages and positive attributes to the nuclear deal. In terms of restrictions and limitations on Iran's nuclear program and how it is a different, it's a wholly different type of inspection regime than we've had in other agreements, which doesn't mean that it's excellent or foolproof, but there are some major advantages to it. My view was that there are also some major flaws and faults and holes in the agreement that we, smart people, should have fixed 2 years ago. And it gives me great regret that we didn't do it then when we had a chance, and that instead of agreeing to this flawed agreement, we could have insisted on a better agreement, not one that needed whole revision or whole renegotiation, but one whose holes could have been fixed, holes in monitoring and verification and compliance and collective action to address the sunset clauses in the agreement when certain things expire, and to close the loophole on ballistic missiles, these sorts of things. I regret that we didn't do that 2 years ago.
But wait, why didn't we?
Well, that's a question that I think is best put to senior officials of the Obama administration. Okay. I think that they will say that some of them will say that the agreement actually covers all these problems, which I think is not correct. Others will say, more honestly, that it's the best that we could have gotten, which I don't think is quite correct either, in the sense that I don't think we fully used all the leverage that we had built up. Remember, this was a moment when the Iranians were back on their heels because of the quite effective imposition of global sanctions. And I don't think we fully exploited that moment to the extent that we should have.
But now, and what was the Washington Institute's ultimate position when it became clear the Senate was not going to stand in the way of the JCPA? In the end, what did the Washington Institute say?
Well, the Institute as an institute doesn't take positions like this, but I wrote a piece 2 years ago urging senators to vote tactically no to give President Obama more leverage to get a better deal from our European and other P5+1 partners to improve the deal. I had a piece in The Atlantic in August of 2015 on that point. Now, flash forward 2 years.
Yes.
And President Trump has made two broad critiques of on Obama administration Iran policy. One is a narrow critique. The narrow critique is the deal is horrible, has holes in it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a broader critique, which is, and we're missing the big picture. The deal, we have an Iran nuclear policy, he said, but we don't have an Iran policy more generally, because Iran is doing all sorts of nefarious things throughout the Middle East, and this deal is sucking out all the oxygen from our policy and doesn't give us any room to counter all the negative things the Iranians are doing throughout the region. We're only focused on the nuclear issue. So in his announcement on Friday, President Trump tried to recalibrate overall U.S. policy on Iran. His first basic point was, we're now going to have an Iran policy, not just an Iran nuclear policy, but a broader Iran policy. And we're going to counter all the negative things the Iranians are doing throughout the region, in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Gaza, in Yemen, you name it. And the main tool he chose to use for that part of the approach is to label as a terrorist organization the principal foreign policy arm of the Iranian government, namely the Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. To label the entire IRGC as a terrorist group and to sanction it under U.S. law. And so doing, to pressure all of our allies and partners against having anything to do with that arm of the Iranian government, which, I should point out, is owns an enormous portion of the Iranian economy, about 30%. So if you can target the IRGC, you really hurt Iran. Now, in terms of the Iran nuclear deal itself, the president, in fact, Mark, he did decertify. That was the biggest aspect of the announcement. But it's important to remember what decertifying means. And here, I hate to get a little complicated, but the law here is a bit convoluted. Under American law, a law that was that many Democratic senators insisted on the Obama administration in order to have their support for the deal, under that law, every 90 days, the President of the United States has to certify that Iran is complying with the deal, but much more than that. He has to certify that the deal remains in America's national interest and that all the terms of the deal are being fully and verifiably enforced. Those statements go far beyond just the statement that Iran is complying with the terms of the deal. So the president made a judgment that the deal is not in America's national interest. I mean, this is no surprise. The president has been saying this since well before his election. But the president also went so far as to say that, as I was saying earlier, that parts of the deal aren't being enforced. Yes, Iran is complying with the parts that people are asking it to comply with, but there are parts which even the IAEA says it can't monitor.
Yes.
I was referring to for example, the computer modeling. Now, the president then offered two paths to how to repair these problems. One path with Congress and another path with our allies. Now, most press reports have said that the president threw the ball into the hands of Congress, which is really, given congressional dysfunction, merely a way of saying that when Congress finds itself unable to fix it, he can blame Congress for American pulling out of the deal. I think it's much more complicated than that. I think what's much more likely is that the administration is first going to go to our European partners, to the British, the French, and the Germans, the three European countries with whom we work to negotiate the Iran nuclear deal, to see if we can agree on correctives, on fixes for some of the problems in the deal. Without opening the deal to renegotiation, there are many ways to correct the problems, to remedy the problems that are in the deal. And then, if we can get that from the Europeans, then to say to Congress, well, it's better than I thought. We've achieved some of what I hope to achieve. And so let's work on how we can recertify the deal later on, or work on new language for that law that allows me to say that the deal is enough to satisfy the national interest requirement.
You know, Rob, as you describe it, it sounds both reasonable and well thought out. But, do you disagree?
That's because maybe you're listening to me.
I am listening to you.
But look, here's the catch. If in a total vacuum, I do think there is much to what the president said that was reasonable and well thought out and makes a lot of good sense. The problem is that to achieve it, to execute what the president said, is going to require some pretty adroit diplomacy, pretty effective leadership, and some, listening and working closely with our international and our international partners, and with the legislative branch. Now, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, right, left, center, I don't think you can say that the administration's strong suit in its first 9 months, has been close partnership with our European allies, or a close and effective working relationship with the leadership of Congress. It's just not what has been the hallmark so far. And that's what's going to take to have an effective implementation of this strategy.
Okay, I understand, but you describe it in a very nuanced way. You know, I keep wondering whether, if the words had not come out of Donald Trump's mouth, whether American Jews would be viewing this differently. And there is, Rob, a majority in the American Jewish community who really believe Trump is a disaster, and that it doesn't matter what he does. If he suggests it, it must be wrong. When I hear you talk, and I didn't know where you were going to go with this, there is at least a rationale behind what the president has done. And I also believe, Rob, there are many people who would now say they didn't feel that the president who preceded him, that President Obama, worked very well with Congress, or that the president did what was necessary to, as you describe, fix the holes in an agreement which many people, including you, never felt was worked out with the kind of intelligence and forethought and working on the details which you're now calling for in retrospect. So do I think presidents at the moment work well with Congress? I don't. I don't know if it's a Donald Trump problem. But what's interesting to me is I have people saying to me all the time, well, should I be for or against certification now? Should I be for or against the United States taking the position that something must be done to make the deal better? Again, I use your phrase, to fill the holes. If some, when you meet people now in Washington and they say to you, Rob, what should we be doing? If an American Jew says to you, an American says to you, Rob, should I be supporting the administration's position on this, or should I be saying, no, we have no business rethinking the Iranian deal? What do you answer?
My view on this is that we should take the opportunity to try to make a better Iran nuclear deal. Do I wish the administration had a better track record of working with its international partners and allies? Yes.
Right.
I do.
I understand.
But this is the world in which we live.
Yes.
This is the moment in which we have to do this. Now, I hope. Look, there are some people. Put it this way: there are some people who view this entire exercise as merely the prelude to ripping up the deal. That it's just a bit of a kabuki dance that the administration is going through to give it an excuse to rip up the deal. I don't think that's the case.
I agree with you.
I think that the administration would want a better, firmer, stronger agreement. I'm not, but I think it's fair to say I'm not convinced it quite knows how to get it.
I agree again.
Nobody I'm
does.
hoping that we figure that out in the next 90 days.
Yes. Very quickly, what do you hear from Israel? Is Israel happy the president has taken this position, or is Israel upset?
Well, the Israeli government very publicly endorsed the president's speech on Friday as a validation of Israel's own concerns about Iran more generally and about the nuclear deal specifically. I think the Israelis welcomed the idea of the Trump administration trying to fix holes in the agreement. I would say that there is still great concern among Israelis that the United States hasn't articulated with specificity a policy toward what the Iranians are doing on the ground in Syria, in Iraq, bringing Iranian assets and proxies right up to the Israeli border, for example, near the Golan Heights. I mean, it's one thing to designate the IRGC as a terrorist organization. Important. But it doesn't actually address the immediate challenge that Israelis are facing with Shiite militias and Iranian proxies now on on two Israeli borders.
I understand.
On Lebanon and the Golan.
I understand. It is wonderful to be able to talk to you and get your perspective. Rob, you bring a perspective that is rarely articulated, and I am so grateful that you always give us time here on JBS. We will speak often in this new Jewish year. I wish you again, Shana Tova Mituka. Have a wonderful, healthy, wonderful, sweet new year, and thank you for always being with us.
Thank you very much, Mark. Take care. Bye-bye.
Robert Satloff, the Executive Director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. As always, my thanks to our Director, Sloan Copeland, Production Coordinator, Serge Goldberg, JBS's Associate Director, Dara Golub, Editors, John McDevitt and Cordelia Sporin, and to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.